A sanctioned oil tanker boarded at sea by European sailors in the middle of the Mediterranean. According to Reuters, an Italian-led European Union naval force carried out the boarding and identified the vessel as part of what officials and analysts call Russia's shadow fleet, the loose, opaquely owned network of aging tankers that has kept Russian oil moving around Western sanctions since early 2022. For more than 3 years, that fleet has sailed through international waters almost completely untouched. This time, a European crew climbed aboard. Why now, in the Mediterranean, and why does one boarding matter when hundreds of these tankers are still moving? That's the question this video is going to walk through. We'll go through what Reuters actually reported, what the shadow fleet is, and how it evades sanctions, why boarding a foreign-flagged tanker at sea is legally rare, and what's still unconfirmed while this story develops. Start with what's actually known. According to Reuters, the boarding was carried out by a European Union naval force led by Italy, operating in the Mediterranean Sea. The force identified the tanker as a sanctioned vessel tied to Russia's shadow fleet, ships that move Russian crude oil in ways designed to sidestep the price cap and embargo measures imposed by the European Union, the G7, and allied governments. Reuters describes the action as a rare instance of direct enforcement against this fleet, which normally operates in international waters, largely beyond the reach of any single European authority. That's the reported fact set. Everything else, the vessel's exact name, its flag, its cargo, and the precise date of the boarding has not been confirmed in the source material available for this video, so we're not going to invent any of it. What we can responsibly explain, as general background, is what the shadow fleet is and why a single boarding is being treated as significant. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the European Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and other allies moved to cut off one of the Kremlin's largest sources of revenue, seaborne oil exports. The centerpiece was a price cap, coordinated through what became known as the Price Cap Coalition, set initially at $60 a barrel for Russian crude carried on Western-flagged, Western-insured tankers. The logic was simple. Russia could still sell its oil, but only at a discount, and only if it used the Western shipping and insurance infrastructure the sanctions coalition controlled. Russia's answer was to build an alternative shipping system almost overnight. Shipping data firms that track tanker movements for a living, Kepler and Lloyd's List Intelligence among them, describe the emergence of a genuine parallel fleet, numbering by some estimates in the hundreds of vessels. These are typically older tankers, often near or past the end of their normal service life, bought up through opaque shell companies registered in jurisdictions that ask few questions. They fly flags of convenience registries in countries such as Gabon, Panama, or the Cook Islands come up often in reporting on this fleet, and they carry insurance, if any, from obscure providers rather than the major Western protection and indemnity clubs that insure most of the world's commercial shipping. It helps to understand the price cap itself, since that's the mechanism this entire fleet exists to get around. The Price Cap Coalition, the European Union, the G7 nations, and Australia set the original limit at $60 a barrel for Russian seaborne crude oil, effective in December 2022. It worked by denying Western shipping services, insurance, and financing to any cargo sold above that price. Over the following years, as enforcement gaps became clear, the coalition revised the cap downward. By the EU's 18th sanctions package, reported in mid-2025, the ceiling had been pushed toward the high 40s per barrel, alongside an expanding, name-by-name blacklist of specific tankers judged to be part of the shadow fleet. Each new package adds more vessels to that list. The tanker involved in this Mediterranean boarding may or may not be one of the specifically named vessels. That detail hasn't been confirmed, but the blacklist itself is real, growing, and public. Geography is part of why a Mediterranean boarding stands out. Most of the shadow fleet's publicized run-ins with European authorities so far happened in the Baltic Sea, not the Mediterranean. That's the common version of the story, and it's not wrong, just incomplete. Russian crude loaded at Baltic ports such as Ust-Luga or at Black Sea terminals like Novorossiysk still has to reach buyers in Asia, and much of that route runs through the Mediterranean before continuing via the Suez Canal or around Africa. A tanker that draws less scrutiny in the Baltic can still pass directly under the noses of Mediterranean naval powers like Italy, Greece, or France later in the same voyage. So the Mediterranean isn't really a surprising new front. It's closer to an inevitable one, once enforcement attention started spreading beyond the Baltic. That spread has been visible for a while. After a string of undersea power cable and data cable incidents in the Baltic Sea through late 2024, Incidents investigators linked to ships, including suspected shadow fleet tankers, dragging anchors across the seabed. NATO launched a dedicated maritime patrol mission in January 2025, publicly named Baltic Sentry, to increase naval presence and monitoring around critical undersea infrastructure in the region. That mission was a response to cable damage, a security concern, rather than to oil sanctions evasion by itself. But it pulled NATO and EU naval assets into sustained, high-visibility contact with the same fleet of tankers this Mediterranean story is now about. Once that kind of naval attention builds up in one European sea, it tends not to stay contained there. That matters more than it sounds like it should. One of the core obstacles facing European and allied enforcement has always been jurisdiction. Under the international law of the sea, a warship can't simply stop and board any merchant vessel it suspects of wrongdoing. The default rule, codified in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, is that a ship on the high seas is subject to the exclusive authority of the state whose flag it flies. Boarding a foreign-flagged vessel without that flag state's consent is normally treated as an exceptional act, reserved for cases like suspected piracy, slave trading, or a vessel sailing without any nationality at all. Sanctions evasion on its own hasn't historically counted as automatic legal grounds for a boarding on the high seas. That's precisely why Reuters frames this operation as rare. Most shadow fleet tankers have simply been shadowed, tracked, and written about, not physically stopped. So how did European navies get around that obstacle? In practice, enforcement has crept forward through narrower legal footholds. Inspections once a tanker enters a nation's territorial waters or exclusive economic zone, port state control checks when a vessel calls at a European port, and, in a handful of publicized cases, boardings justified by concerns about a ship's flag registration itself. If a tanker's claimed flag state denies the ship is validly registered to it, that strips away the normal jurisdictional shield. European officials have spent 3 years mostly watching this fleet sail past them. What changed, according to Reuters, is that this time, in the Mediterranean, watching turned into boarding. There's a safety dimension here that gets less attention than the sanctions politics, and it's worth being precise about, since it's well documented rather than speculative. Maritime insurers and shipping safety analysts have repeatedly flagged that many shadow fleet tankers are older vessels, some approaching or past 20 years of age, operating without the standard Western protection and indemnity coverage that would normally fund a cleanup after a collision or an oil spill. European coastal states along busy shipping lanes, Denmark and Estonia in the Baltic, Italy, Spain, and Greece in the Mediterranean have separately raised this as an environmental and safety concern, apart from the sanctions question. An uninsured, aging tanker breaking apart or running aground near a coastline is a very different problem than a company quietly violating a sanctions regulation on paper. That combination, sanctions evasion plus uninsured maritime risk, is part of why European navies have been willing to escalate from tracking to boarding, even with an uncertain legal foundation under the normal rules of the high seas. There's real precedent for this kind of escalation, and it didn't start in Italy. In December 2024, Finland's navy detained and boarded the tanker Eagle S in the Baltic Sea after an undersea power cable and several data cables were damaged nearby, with Finnish authorities investigating possible anchor-dragging sabotage. Around the same period, France's navy inspected a tanker off its Atlantic coast, a vessel reported in French and international press as flying the flag of Benin, later reflagged after questions were raised about the validity of that registration. Estonia's navy has separately shadowed and, in at least one case, attempted to intervene against a suspected shadow fleet tanker in the Gulf of Finland. Piece those episodes together, spread across the Baltic and now apparently the Mediterranean, and a pattern starts to show. European states testing, case by case, how far they can legally push against a fleet built specifically to sit just outside the reach of Western law. One detail that stuck out while researching this story is how much the shadow fleet depends on things that sound almost mundane: flag paperwork, insurance certificates, transponder settings, rather than anything dramatic. Shipping analysts who track this fleet point to a recurring tactic: tankers switching off their automatic identification system transponders, the GPS-linked beacons meant to broadcast a vessel's position for safety reasons, to obscure ship-to-ship oil transfers conducted in open water, far from any coastline, away from any single nation's enforcement reach. Here's what's most surprising about a story like this. The enforcement gap was never really about spotting these ships. Western intelligence and commercial tracking firms have been able to identify and follow shadow fleet vessels for years. The ships are large, their routes are visible by satellite, and firms like Kepler publish regular estimates of the fleet's size and cargo volumes. The obstacle was never information. It was authority. Knowing where a tanker is does nothing if no one has the legal standing to stop it. That's the gap this Mediterranean boarding appears to test. What this tells us about the broader sanctions effort, 3.5 years in, is worth sitting with. A price cap and an embargo only work if there's a credible enforcement mechanism behind them. And for most of this war, that mechanism has looked more like reputational pressure and data tracking than physical interdiction. A single tanker boarding, rare as Reuters describes it, doesn't by itself close the shadow fleet down. What it may signal is a shift from watching the problem to physically testing where the legal and political limits of intervention actually sit. And that raises the take that will probably split opinion. If a fleet numbering in the hundreds of vessels is still moving Russian oil to market 3 years after the price cap was announced, then arguably the coalition enforcing that cap has, so far, been outpaced by the workaround it was supposed to prevent. One boarding in the Mediterranean, however rare and however real, reads as a strong symbolic move more than a structural fix. Reasonable people can disagree on that. Some will say incremental enforcement, tanker by tanker, is exactly how sanctions regimes are supposed to mature. Others will say it's far too little, far too late, against a fleet this size. Which brings us to where this story currently stands and where it doesn't. Confirmed, according to Reuters, an Italian-led EU naval force boarded a tanker in the Mediterranean Sea and identified it as part of Russia's shadow fleet, tied to sanctions evasion in what's described as a rare direct enforcement action. Not yet confirmed, at least not in the reporting available at the time of this video. The tanker's name and current flag registration, the specific cargo and its origin or destination, the exact legal justification cited for the boarding, whether any crew were detained or the vessel redirected to a port, and whether this is a one-off action or the start of a broader, sustained EU enforcement posture in the Mediterranean. Would you have expected the Mediterranean, rather than the Baltic, to be the next front in this kind of enforcement? Put yourself in the position of a European naval commander for a moment. You can track a tanker on satellite data for months, know exactly what officials suspect it's carrying, and still have no clean legal basis to stop it in international waters. That tension sits underneath every one of these boardings, in the Baltic or here in the Mediterranean. It's not yet public which specific EU sanctions listing the tanker was matched against, whether Italy acted under a standing EU naval mission or an ad hoc coalition arrangement, or how the vessel's flag state has responded, if at all. Those are the details that will separate a one-time enforcement story from evidence of a real change in strategy, and they're worth watching for as follow-up reporting comes in from Reuters and other outlets covering the Mediterranean and Russia's oil trade. Will the EU expand this kind of at-sea boarding beyond the Mediterranean, into the Baltic and Black Sea as well? Comment YES if you think this becomes a regular tactic, or no if you think this stays a rare, one-off action. For now, the confirmed fact is a narrow one, but it's a real one. After 3 years of a shadow fleet operating largely beyond reach, a European naval force went aboard one of its tankers. Whether that turns into a pattern or stays an isolated case is the open loop this story leaves behind, and it's exactly the kind of enforcement story worth following as it develops, alongside the Baltic Sea cable sabotage cases and the EU's ongoing sanctions package expansions that keep adding new tankers to its blacklist.